Have you ever wondered if the mind survives after death? This is one of the topics Betty Shine in her book Mind to Mind discusses. Yet there is another question. If the mind survives, what of the soul? In the following chapters, Betty Shine examines evidence and her experiences that suggest that mind is not entirely dependent on the physical body and that it can continue to exist in some form beyond death. She shares testimonies involving after-death communication, and in too many instances, Betty knew things about deceased relatives that only the living relatives knew. She emphasizes that these first-hand testimonials offer hope to the living and a deeper understanding of life, death, and the continuity of the mind beyond our physical existence. Since the time of recorded history of ancient civilizations, whether as recorded in Egyptian books of the dead or by the Greek philosophers such as Plato or poets like Homer, the concept of some part of man survives has been entertained. In today's times, science can't quite explain if mind survives, but I believe that we are getting closer. Science has not produced empirical evidence confirming the existence of a soul, as it is generally considered an immaterial entity outside the scope of natural sciences. And modern neuroscience focuses on consciousness, which is currently understood as a product of brain activity rather than a separate surviving essence. I've left you a few links to check out on this topic. There's one article where Dr. Sam Parnia, a leading expert in resuscitation science research, explains how death is not an absolute but a process and what happens when patients experience death. He adds that nobody has ever been able to show how brain cells, which produce proteins, can generate something so different, thoughts or consciousness. Interestingly, there has never been a plausible biological mechanism proposed to account for this. And he also states that because this raises the possibility that the entity we call the mind or consciousness may not be produced by the brain. It's certainly possible that maybe there's another layer of reality that we haven't yet discovered that's essentially beyond what we know of the brain and which determines our reality. Now, personally, I will first say I'm not a psychic, yet I am sensitive to impressions, and I have a natural ability to see connections of patterns and symbols as it relates to individual experiences. I must say, though, that when I've done tarot consultations for my clients, every now and then I will get what I call a feeling of clairaudience, where there are impressions in the back of my ear, and then I get images. And usually I will ask, do you know anything about this, this, and that? And so that is, I guess, could be a form of mediumship. It's just something that I take in stride and I don't give it too much thought. But when it happens, it happens. Now, I could tell you one thing. I've had a near-death experience, and it seems now that they're trying to give it a new name. Instead of calling it near-death experience or NDEs, they're thinking of renaming it and calling it post-death experience. But the debate remains as to that clear demarcation or delineation of defining the exact moment of death. So it seems that in most NDEs, people are being resuscitated, as was my case. What the paramedics did to bring me back is the science of it, and what transpired with my essence outside of the physical body is an experience altogether otherworldly for another video. If you can relate with anything that I've shared in this introduction, share your thoughts and leave a comment. Let me know you were here. I know that your time is valuable and I appreciate you visiting with me. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn the page. Part 1, Spiritual Gifts, Chapter 4, The Survival of the Mind. A quote from the Chandogya Upanishad 7:26 and 2. He who sees this does not see death. He sees neither illness nor suffering. He who sees this sees all that is. He attains everything, everywhere. End quote. In 1985, a young man lost his ex-wife and children in a particularly horrific fashion. The story, with all the ingredients of a murder mystery, grabbed the newspaper headlines. For the bereaved young man, this was real life and not a thriller. By the time he contacted me a year later, although someone had been accused, the mystery, as far as he was concerned, was still unsolved. He had been through an enormous amount of anguish and was nearly cracking up. Although he had never been interested in spiritual matters before, from the moment of the tragedy itself, all kinds of odd things started to happen, and from time to time, he would feel tremendously peaceful and supported. Curious coincidences seemed to be pointing to some meaning in it all. Despite this, he had reached a point of near collapse when a friend lent him Michael Bentine's autobiographical book, The Door-Marked Summer. The book made him think, and wanting to understand more, he wrote to Michael telling him something about himself and asking how he could contact a reliable medium. He knew nothing of mediums and couldn't afford emotionally or financially to come across a charlatan. Michael gave him 2 names, one of them mine, and said, "Don't tell me anything else about yourself, because the less I know, the more value there will be in what the medium will tell you." Although I lived relatively far away, there was apparently something about the name Shine that appealed to him. In the summer of 1986, some 3 months after reading Michael's book, he telephoned me. All he told me about himself was that his first name was Colin. Immediately, I got a strong impression and said, "My God, your nervous system is in tatters. It's shot to pieces. Did you have a nervous breakdown 2 or 3 months ago, or come close to one?" He agreed that he had, though he hadn't thought that his voice betrayed the fact, but that he felt a lot calmer now. I went on, "You need healing yourself, but I can give you absent healing. You have a good friend with you, who's with you the whole time, and he's sort of looking after you." Colin, thinking of a pal who had been staying with him to keep an eye on him, said, "Yes, that's right. And he died in a road accident about 3 years ago?" "What?" "He seems to have been with you for the last 8 months. Does that ring any bells? He's someone you had a very good rapport with." Colin immediately remembered that 8 months ago he had heard of the death of a good friend he had once worked with, who had been killed on a motorbike about 2 years earlier. Suddenly, he began to understand why everything around him was beginning to fall into place. While we were still on the telephone, I received a great deal of clairvoyant information, which I passed on to him. I told him, "Your friend is saying that the project you are working on is very, very important, and you may have to go out on a limb over it." Colin was very impressed by this, as it wasn't a phrase he had heard used much, but he had just read Shirley MacLaine's book, Out on a Limb. I didn't know it, but he was writing a book about his experiences, partly as therapy and partly in order to tell the truth to the public. By the time we ended the conversation, he was already convinced that I wasn't a charlatan. But there was a great deal more to come when he visited me the following week. Colin was a pleasant, nice-looking man in his early 30s. I still had no idea who he was. I took him into my healing room, and we immediately picked up where we had left off. He had brought a tape with him, and we tape recorded the session. As usual, there were terrible disturbances on the recording, but it was audible enough for him to type up a transcript afterwards. He noticed that the interference became worse as more people came through, and plenty of people came through. Straight away, I got the impression of a terrible tragedy. When I receive this kind of survival evidence, I feel awful. My stomach tightens up as if I were sharing in the fear, and I can feel affected for days afterwards. "Does this involve your 2 children?" I asked. "And your ex-wife?" Colin, looking rather amazed, nodded agreement. I went on. "There were 2 or 3 other people involved. I don't know who they are at the moment. Older people. They were 2 men and a woman. Colin just stared at me. I suppose he hadn't expected me to pick up his situation in quite such an accurate detail. Then I heard the voices of 2 little boys, one of whom sounded older than the other. They sounded happy and were laughing. I described them to Colin. He told me that they were actually 6-year-old twins, but that one did sound older. The second one cultivated a babyish voice because he was the younger by a few minutes. A little later, I heard this younger voice saying, "You'll know that I'm Nicholas." That, said Colin, was what he always used to say to make sure he wasn't muddled up with his brother Daniel. Daniel never felt that he needed to make that distinction. Then an older man came through. I described his personality, and Colin recognized it as his father-in-law. This man was very angry about something. I told Colin that the man himself would have to deal with it. This bothered Colin because it seemed to be something over and above the terrible events, and he couldn't understand what it was. Now he does, and the reason will probably be made public in due course. The man now started shouting about someone called David. "Who's David?" I asked. "This man is saying that David knows all the answers." "That'll be his nephew." "Well, David knows all the answers, and at some time or another David is going to have to tell you." At this point, knowing that David's evidence was important and also confidential, Colin made up his mind that I had given him enough survival evidence to convince him. He decided to tell me that his full name was Colin Caffel. It was his ex-wife, Sheila, the model called Bambi, who had been murdered with their 2 children and her parents in a mass shooting at an Essex farmhouse the year before. Her brother Jeremy had by now been charged with the murders. The police had told David Boutflower not to speak to anyone, including Colin, so no one at the time knew that David was the person who found a blood-stained silencer in the gun cupboard, as well as other evidence showing that things had been set up to incriminate Sheila. Colin has been writing his own story, so I won't go into further detail about the shootings, but many of the things that I was able to tell him did not make sense until much later, some time after the trial. Colin was seemingly glad to know that the twins were well and happy, and greatly comforted when he learned that they had made the transition in their sleep. I told him they're laughing. Every time they come through, they are laughing. Colin told me that was how they were in life. Everything struck them as hilarious, although it's tragic. I said, it's almost as though they made the transition so quickly they didn't have time to think about anything. "What about Sheila?" he asked. "Does she know what happened?" I said, "Your wife has been put into a state of rest. She is being looked after." I was then given a great deal of information about Colin's work. "Do you do sculpture?" I asked. He told me that he was a potter by profession, but had just started experimenting with sculpture. He was planning on a sculpture of Sheila and the twins. I told him, it's not a gift you were born with. It's been given you for a purpose. A sculptor has attached himself to you for his own progression, and because he has the same vibrational rate as you, he's been given the job of helping you. At that time, I couldn't give the sculptor's name, but later on, when I spent an evening with Colin, I was given the name of Rodin. And later on still, another medium also told Colin that Rodin was working through him. I then told him that eventually that particular gift would leave him once it had fulfilled its purpose. The last 2 sculptures you'll do will be of your children because I can see them finished. Then that will be the finish of that part of your life. You will have paid a debt, as it were. Not that you owe them anything, but it is your debt to yourself. It's almost as though the living minds of your children are going to enter these pieces. I could also see that he had a gift as a writer, and that in future he would be helping people through writing and lecturing. After our first session, Colin felt greatly reassured. He checked over the tape and transcribed it. There were a few things he felt that I might have picked up telepathically, but overall he was convinced. He played the tape to a very skeptical friend of his, Brian, who had previously warned him against visiting occult types. Brian was amazed at the transformation in him. So much light shone from him and still does, he wrote afterwards. It was as though Betty had almost brought the people who were lost in the tragedy back to him. He was totally convinced they were well and happy. Brian, who is in the music business and was going through a bad time himself, decided to come to see me, too. He made an appointment without telling me of his connection with Colin. I was able to advise him and help him. Numerous people came through whom he could not fail to recognize, among them one of Colin's twins, Daniel. He reminded Brian that he used to sit on his shoulders to try to reach a big silver balloon in the air in a place full of flashing lights. Brian recognized this as a mirror ball hung from the ceiling that Daniel had wanted to play with at one of their performances. He found this all the more convincing because only Daniel would sit on his shoulders. Nicholas considered it too babyish. For the no longer skeptical Brian, the coup de grace was when a little boy called Harry also came through, wanting to say hi and thanks for the chance to play the piano. Brian was staggered. 3 years before, he had been in a band that had played at the Royal Albert Hall. Harry was about 12, a keen young pianist whose parents were friends of Brian. Before the performance, Brian had invited him to come early for the sound check and to have a look at the keyboard instruments. The band had let Harry play the Steinway grand piano for the sound engineer to set the test, and for 10 minutes or so, Harry had played the piano at the Albert Hall. Pure happiness written all over his face. Harry had died tragically shortly before Brian's visit, but what he recalled was that happy occasion, not the sadness of his death. Colin was satisfied with the evidence that he had been given at our session, but he received even more when he joined us for dinner one evening shortly before Christmas. Once again, the twins came through, still laughing and happy, and we all had to put down our knives and forks and listen to what they had to say. Interestingly, they mentioned that someone called Ollie was still sad. Ollie was a friend of Colin who had taken his own life when the twins were quite small. The point of this message seemed to be that suicide is not an answer. I have also had many suicides who have come through quite quickly and have found peace of mind. Clearly, it is we ourselves who eventually have to make the effort to progress. Next, the twins told Colin not to forget to hang his Christmas bell again this year. They were referring to a Christmas wind chime with a model of Bambi attached to it, which hung on a rosebush behind their grave. Colin didn't discover until his next visit to the cemetery that it had gone missing and had to be replaced. The twins were evidently there ahead of him. And then they told us, "Mummy's back, she's awake, she's been to see us." Later on, Sheila herself came through and sent a personal message to Colin. Since that time, Colin has been growing and progressing as a person. He has been both sculpting and writing, has been to a number of workshops on healing and similar subjects, and visited the spiritual community of Finhorn. Above all, writing his own book has helped him to make sense of what must have seemed a total waste of so many lives. Few lives are really wasted. I have included Colin's story at length because it contains so many of the things I teach, that the mind and the personality do not die, that we come here with a purpose, and that what we don't learn or fulfill in this life, we carry on to the next. It also shows the value of mediumship and survival evidence. In my experience, people only receive information from the dead when they are in need, or when there is a real purpose behind the communication. That's why people who visit mediums simply out of curiosity can be disappointed. The main purpose of survival evidence is to prove to those living in this dimension that the mind does not and cannot die. This explains why some messages from the dead appear trivial to those not personally involved. Those unexciting messages concerned with small domestic details show that the communicators are still watching over the people they care about. Many of my clients have told me that they never thought they would find themselves sitting talking with a medium or a healer, that they'd never been able to understand why others needed to seek such help. Nevertheless, there they were, sitting in my room because they were in desperate need and could think of nobody else who could help them. Probably the most common reason for the dead wishing to communicate with their friends and relatives is simply to bring them peace of mind. This happened recently with my daughter, Janet. She had a very close friend, a pupil at her yoga class called Annette. Long before she fell ill, she and Janet used to have deep conversations about life and death and what the afterlife would be like. Annette often used to say, "If anything happens to me, I shall certainly come back and let you know." Annette had a lot of stress in her personal life, and at only 43, she became riddled with cancer. Even so, she managed during her last few months to be of great help to someone close to her who had severe problems. When she died, Janet was grief-stricken. Knowing that your friends survived doesn't stop you missing them. One evening, while meditating, she thought, "The person I'd most like to hear from is Annette." It happened that the next day I had invited Charles Horry, the medium who had originally told me I must be a healer, to lunch. I wanted to thank him and tell him how I'd been doing in the last 13 years. Janet was not with us and didn't even know he was coming. In the middle of the meal, I was chatting to Charles when he said, "Hang on, I must stop you, Betty, because I have Annette here." It was quite clearly Janet's friend, who told us that she was glad to be released from all her pain, that she was now totally happy and peaceful and thrilled to find herself in a very beautiful place. Janet was thrilled too when I told her about this. It was just what she needed at the time. Although she herself has given some extraordinary survival evidence and has often received it from me, it was the first time she had heard it from another medium. It is nice that it should have come through Charles Horry. Some people object that visiting mediums is a way to avoid going through the grieving process. This isn't my experience. Coping with the death of someone we have loved dearly, or even an acquaintance with whom we have spent time, is always difficult. What we are really suffering from, however, is our own selfishness. This is something we have to deal with throughout life, but death really brings it home to us. Of course, it is normal to grieve. However, most people go to mediums a little while after death when, like Colin and Janet, they have been through the grieving process and feel that enough is enough. When grief continues too long, it is very unproductive. Learning that their loved ones are alive and happy releases people from their negative grief. They themselves can become happy and positive again and get on with living. If you think about it, death, whether through accident or through disease, occurs because of the breakdown of the physical body. When we cease to be healthy and suffering goes on a long time, death is a gift. Therefore, we should be happy for those whose minds have been freed from pain. I have known some people who, knowing that a relative is going to die of a painful or debilitating disease, have been able to do their grieving beforehand. The grief is not suppressed, but when that person finally leaves them, they are able to feel glad for and with them. This seems to me a very positive approach. I don't believe in visiting mediums time and time again. This kind of obsession has given mediumship a bad name. If you want to keep in touch with someone and send them your love, you can always sit quietly and think about them. If people want to see me more than twice for survival evidence, I try quite firmly to dissuade them. I point out that it isn't healthy to go on living in the past, nor is it good for the person who has moved into the other dimension and needs to get on with their life. Mentally, hanging on holds them imprisoned by your mind. If they come back later without being sought after, then it will be of their own free will and for a good reason, not because they feel obliged to keep reassuring the bereaved. Children are perhaps the hardest of all to let go of. The death of a child is always tragic. When a mother or father receives evidence that their child is happy and continuing to learn and grow, it can bring them enormous comfort and help them to let the child go. In fact, bereaved parents are in constant touch with their children. Did they but know it? The children are obviously aware of this, even if the parents are not. Very often, after a child has come through, the mother will say, "Isn't that strange? I've been dreaming about him." I will explain that she has not been merely dreaming, but has actually left her body during sleep to be reunited with the child. This is also the case in many dreams about dead friends and loved ones. In fact, the mind is ageless, in the sense in which we understand aging, but the spirit of a departed child will come through as a child and will even continue growing up in other dimensions in order to show the mother that life continues after death. Colin's twins told us that when they first arrived, they were being looked after by a relative. There are people in the other dimension who choose to help children. In Colin's case, a woman came through whom he couldn't remember, but who had had a strong connection with Colin's own childhood. Later he learned who she was, and that she had lost her own twins at birth. Now she belonged to a group whose task was to take care of children. She told us that the twins were very happy and continuing their lives as they had here, each following his individual path. Quite often, people are truly liberated by death, especially if the mind has been trapped and is unable to express itself in an impaired body. One day I was giving healing to a young Australian when a young man came through. He told us that he had drowned in a pond near his home in Australia. He described his home and the surrounding countryside, and added that although he had been very happy on earth, it was only now that his mind was free of his body that he knew what it was to be a whole person. My client listened intently. He clearly knew who the young man was and appeared very moved as the message went on. The speaker was insistent that he should relay his words to his mother in Australia, telling her how much he had loved her and thanking her for the love she had given him. At the end of this very touching piece of survival evidence, my Australian friend told me that the communicator had been his brother, who in this life had suffered from Down's syndrome. Later, he told me that the message had indeed brought peace to their mother. We do not stop learning after death. On the contrary, it is important to continue to progress spiritually, which includes making up for past mistakes or for any hurts we may have caused to others. It is not unusual for minds to come through to ask forgiveness for something they have done or failed to do during their lifetime. One young woman, Jilly, was sitting with me when her father, who had died 2 weeks before, came through and begged her for forgiveness. There's nothing for him to feel guilty about, she said, but he was adamant that there was, and that he was very unhappy about it. I changed my will, he told her, but I promise you I will make it up to you somehow. About a week later, Jilly learned that her father had left his entire estate to a woman he had just met, rendering his daughter homeless. She was heartbroken, though she was helped by recalling her father's promise. 3 years later, her paternal aunt died unexpectedly, leaving Jilly a small fortune and telling her in a letter that she had felt it only right to leave her the money because she had been so wronged by her father. Coincidence? I don't think so. I have heard too many stories like this to believe they could all be coincidences. When people make promises in the other dimension, they keep them, and her father must have impressed his wishes to his sister. Incidentally, Jilly had not told her aunt or anyone else about her father's messages, knowing they would not have approved of her visiting a medium. Sometimes a mind will come through simply to help someone they were fond of in life. Jean and her mother, Mrs. G, had never visited a medium or a healer before. Although Jean came for a healing, their beliefs about life after death were totally changed in 1.5 hours. Jean had been in a car accident in America, and specialists there in Britain had advised her to have her spleen removed as she was bleeding internally. She wanted to avoid this if she could, and on the recommendation of a friend got in touch with me for a healing. I'm glad to say she completely recovered after 2 healing sessions and no operation was necessary. On her first visit, she brought her mother with her, and it was to Mrs. G that I suddenly found myself passing on advice concerning her finances. What I was given was so extraordinarily detailed and specific that I could hardly believe it myself. It was even more of a shock when the communicator told me who he was. In his lifetime, he had been a very well-known financier. There could have been no one in the world better able to advise on finance. When I told Mrs. G his name, I laughed because it seemed so incredible. But she looked at me seriously and told me that this man had been her greatest friend and had always advised her when he was alive. Her whole face was illuminated. She didn't need to tell me what happiness this contact had given her. I had no idea who Jean and her mother were before they came to see me. There could have been no question of telepathic communication between us, since the action advised by her unseen friend was not in her mind. In fact, she told me she would never have thought of taking the course he recommended. I learned later that she had done as he suggested, and that it turned out extremely well. In the last 100 years, all kinds of mediums have made their appearance in this country. Trance, physical, and mental mediums. Some of them are very high quality. Yet there are still closed-minded people who claim that at best they have nothing to offer, and at worst they're charlatans. It is true that because psychic phenomena can't always be produced to order, some mediums in the past became afraid of failing and being ridiculed and decided to cheat a little. This was their downfall, and it did no service to their cause. All the wonderful things they had proved were discounted because someone with no understanding of mediumistic gifts had something to hang them with. One of the most dramatic pieces of evidence I have ever witnessed was on the platform of a local spiritualist church hall. This was early in my healing days, when I was still exploring the psychic field and we were promised an evening of transfiguration. I managed to persuade Janet to accompany me, which she did with great reluctance. I had no idea what to expect. I had read about transfiguration and knew that it was a very rare gift, hardly ever seen. I set off for the meeting feeling quite excited, though armed with a great deal of skepticism. When we arrived, the hall was packed with several hundred people. We found our seats and sat quietly for about 10 minutes. The medium's rather theatrical appearance on the platform caused quite a stir. When everyone had settled down, she said some prayers and then explained what she was about to do. She would lean forward slightly with her hands cupped together, scoop up ectoplasm from around her, and bring it to her face. From then on, any spirit person wanting to make contact would form an image of his face over hers and would speak directly to people in the audience. I gathered he would use her vocal cords, though quite how I couldn't work it out. In fact, during all these preliminaries, I was thinking to myself, what a lot of rubbish. The audience sat hushed as she went through the process she had described. Suddenly, her face started to change. I sat glued to my chair. This was the most exciting evidence I had ever seen. Slowly, a new and quite different face began to build up. Hairstyle, eyes, nose, mouth, until it became that of a middle-aged woman. As the medium turned this way and that, giving us a three-dimensional view, I could hardly believe my eyes. Then she spoke in a completely different voice, giving a name and address. "It's my sister!" exclaimed someone in the audience. What followed was quite extraordinary. A two-way conversation between the dead woman and her sister. When this was finished, the woman's face dissolved to be replaced by that of a man, topped by sleek black hair and even wearing a mustache. He was followed by an old man with a beard and glasses. Again, the names were given. Again, recognition from people in the audience. Again, emotional reunions. I was too transfixed to listen to what was said. It was as though these people had actually returned to life. Almost the last person to appear was an elderly lady with hair pulled back in a bun and with a lovely smile. Looking across in our direction, she said, "You never thought you would see me, did you?" The woman sitting next to me grabbed my arm and cried, "My God, it's my mother." Tears streaming down her face as her mother began to speak, and it took some time for me to persuade her to put her hand up so that the medium would know the lady had been recognized. Still clinging onto my arm, she answered her mother's questions. As this face finally dissolved, she was still weeping with happiness. All my skepticism had taken a back seat. Much more common than this extraordinary experience is trance mediumship, in which the medium's mind moves out of the way to allow a spirit, very often a guide, to speak or heal through them. Very often the medium is unaware of what is going on during this time. I think spirit people are working through mediums and healers all the time, but some of them prefer to work directly in this way to ensure that they don't get misinterpreted. Several times when I first started healing, I felt my own face begin to change and had a strong inclination to waft off. On one occasion I went along with it and apparently spoke in the voice of a Norwegian man. I can't remember any of it myself. Janet found this very frightening, and as I always like to know what's going on, I never allowed it to happen again. But I often find myself saying things that surprise me. Sometimes, when I've been given a lecture, I've said afterwards to Janet, "That was very interesting. I didn't know that." Someone has obviously been speaking through me. It is because of the continued existence of the mind that mediums can give a clear physical description of a person who is communicating, and the dead can reproduce their features in transfiguration. The surviving mind, with the memory of its physical characteristics still intact, is able to project an image that is recognizable to the recipient. Survival evidence also shows that whoever we are in life, we continue to be when we find ourselves in the next dimension. We do not suddenly become all-powerful and all-knowing. I am often asked why communications contain so much detail about the departed person's everyday life. We have to keep things in perspective. For millions of people on this planet, life is fairly undramatic and repetitive. A daily round of looking after or providing for the family, working, shopping, cooking, sleeping, with the occasional holidays and outings. So what is most deeply implanted in the mind are naturally the ordinary, everyday things. Nor does dying suddenly make us extremely holy. Let me give you an example. Alan first visited me for hypnotherapy to give up smoking. After the session had finished, I told him that someone called Jim had come through, saying they had played golf together. Alan knew at once who it was. Jim then said through me, "You never did get a hole-in-one, you old bugger." He was referring to a long-standing joke between them. Alan and Jim had had a bet on who would be the first one to get a hole-in-one, and there was no mistaking the form of address. On the face of it, this contact could seem rather frivolous, but that was exactly Jim's way. At the time, Alan was in need of the reassurance that there is a life after death, and for Jim to speak as he always had, answered that need. Some people are shocked when the deceased come out with a bad language, but these lively dead can bring a lot of fun into the conversation, and how else should they speak? The personality survives death, and if someone had a sense of humor when alive, it will still burst through undiminished during communication. One day, I was giving a healing to a woman when her brother Mike came through. He had been killed in a car accident 2 years earlier. For the next hour, Mike regaled us with joke after joke. We spent the whole session laughing. My sitter commented that if he hadn't come through with jokes, it wouldn't have been her brother. Mike also had a more serious reason for communicating. He told us that he had been secretly engaged and had died before he could tell his family. During the following week, his sister made a number of enquiries, and with the aid of the information Mike had given her, she managed to trace his fiancée and broke the news of his death. The young woman said that Mike had never given her his home address. When she stopped hearing from him, she assumed that she had been just a passing fancy and had been too hurt to make extensive enquiries herself. This is another example of how, if something has been left undone, the dead person will leave no stone unturned until he can make things right again. With my life so busy, I never gave much thought to the afterlife of animals until it was brought forcibly to my attention. I had been healing for about 6 years. I was working very hard and had had a particularly difficult day. As I sat relaxing in the evening, I found myself in the other dimensional garden that I still visit regularly. I was making my usual way along the path when something landed on my shoulder. Perhaps I should explain that when I'm in this garden, the experience is quite real and physical. If I want to, I can touch objects and leaves and feel them as solid. This experience, however, was so very physical and so unexpected that it made me jump. Then I realized that it was my cat. There on my shoulder was the cat who had been put to sleep when I left Spain, purring and wrapping herself around my neck. It was a very emotional reunion and a very beautiful one, as well as reassuring experience. Ever since then, whenever I visit my garden, Sadie is always there to greet me. Sometimes she jumps on my shoulder, sometimes she just walks along beside me. I had grieved for her for a long time. Now I have ceased to grieve. I hope this will comfort others who have lost pets. Like people, animals continue to exist in another dimension and are still drawn to the people who have loved them. Much more attention is being paid these days to the process of dying. In the past, the subject tended to be brushed under the carpet. Nowadays, there are counselors in hospitals and hospices to help the dying on their journey into the next life. I feel sure that older people and the terminally ill, anyone, indeed, who fears death, could also receive a great deal of comfort from talks by mediums who could prove to them beyond doubt that there is a life after this one. I have often been asked to help relieve the pain of the terminally ill, and have also often had to tell relatives that the sick person will probably die quite quickly. While healing can very often prolong life, it will speed up the process of dying if that is in the person's interest. When life is made intolerable through illness, healing helps to release the mind energy from the physical body. Countless people close to death have conversed with spirit people who are waiting to accompany them on their journey. The joy on their faces when they have recognized their loved ones is indescribable. This phenomenon happens far too often to be ignored or passed off as the fantasy of a dying person. Understanding that the mind cannot die can remove the fear of death once and for all. James was a dark-haired, gentle, good-looking young man who never told me his surname. At only 26, he was facing the fact that he was dying of leukemia. I think his main reason for wanting to see me was to prepare himself for death by finding out all he could about the other dimension. I knew that there was nothing I could do as far as a cure was concerned, but healing always relieves pain and brings peace, so I saw him regularly for some months. During his first appointment, James' grandmother came through, and after confirming their identity by giving her name and describing her appearance, she went on to describe the house she had lived in and mentioned members of the family by name. She then gave a graphic account of the dimension in which she now found herself. In particular, she emphasized how beautiful the colors were and how clean everything was. Finally, she gave a description of 4 members of the family and details of their careers which baffled James completely, as he knew nothing about them. On his 3rd visit, however, he told me he had found someone who did know them and that the descriptions he had given were perfectly accurate. He looked at me and said, "For the first time since I learned I was going to die, I have found peace. You have proved to me that there is a life after death." He smiled and went on, "I shall have to improve my mind as quickly as possible. I've wasted so much of my time and I don't want to appear a moron to the people who have to cope with me when I arrive at my next destination." James lived for 6 months after this, considerably longer than his medical prognosis. During this short period, he read everything he could about the universe and the collective mind, and when the time came, he died peacefully. I know that his personality continues, but even so, I miss his physical presence. He had a lovely personality. In fact, he was one of those people who seem almost too nice to be here. He always had a faraway look in his eyes, as though he had only decided to come here for a short time. I think that some souls come here only briefly for a particular purpose, and once this is accomplished, they leave again peacefully. What James was, I never knew. My clairvoyance only shows me what is necessary for me to know, and we did not talk about it. Dying can be a joyful and even exciting experience, and there is really nothing to fear. When we die, we are taken care of. There have been many accounts by people who have had near-death experiences, describing how they traveled down a tunnel at the end of which they came to a bright light and were greeted by someone who loved them. To people who find this far-fetched, I point out that dying is very like being born. which we all have experienced. When you come into this world, you travel through the birth canal and enter into a place where the lights are suddenly bright and people who love you are waiting to welcome you. Many of those who have returned from a brush with death describe extraordinary experiences and visions during a tantalizing glimpse into the unknown, which many of them find all too brief. I believe this experience can be accounted for by shock dislodging the mind energy, enabling people to see into the other dimension just as mediums can. No one is ever the same after a near-death experience. A new spirituality enters the very substance of their being, and their thought processes changes totally. There can be no fear of dying, having once seen through our own dimension and tasted knowledge of the life beyond. Death is far from being the end. It is a birth into a new kind of life and into further spiritual progress. Heaven and hell are within us both here and after death, and it is up to us to decide which we prefer. There are a few people who do not progress or progress only slowly. They include those who have lived really evil lives and find it difficult to break the habit even after death. There are also people who are so materialistic that they become totally attached to their surroundings and never leave them. A woman whose pride in her home has become the entire focus of her life may want to remain near it. That is one reason why houses are haunted. Ghosts are the minds of people who don't want to move on. Love, whether of a place or of a person, can also prevent someone from moving on. You cannot progress spiritually until you have let go and rejected materialistic values. I do not mean that we should all become hermits and give away all our possessions. It is more a question of attitude, of whether you own your possessions or they own you. Material things will always keep you imprisoned in this life and the next. I think that people who do not own a tremendous amount are the happiest. The people who are contented and peaceful within themselves, who have time to see, to feel, to be, and to have a spiritual relationship with nature. Those who do move on report very similar experiences. It is fascinating when they communicate with descriptions of the next dimension. One young man came through and described what happened immediately after his death. He found himself standing high up on a mountain, just as if he'd been dropped by a helicopter. He couldn't understand how he had got there because he didn't realize that he was dead. Almost immediately, he was approached by a man he recognized as his late uncle, who conveyed to him telepathically that he was now in the next dimension. It seems that people find themselves in a variety of locations, much as they would do here when they are born, but they have certain features in common. This young man described the scenery around him as quite beautiful. Beyond the mountain on which he found himself on arrival, further mountain ranges and valleys lay misted by a blue haze. The temperature was like that of a pleasant English summer day, but although it was comfortably warm, there was no visible sun. This often seems to baffle people who find themselves in the other dimension. The grass looked and felt the same as earthly grass except for the vividness of the color. It was the colors that astounded him most. They were quite fantastic, just as they are in my other dimensional garden. Time and again, people have given me similar descriptions, always commenting on the wonderful colors. On arrival in the next dimension, it seems that people are first of all taken care of, in whatever way may be necessary. When I first spoke with Colin Caffell, his ex-wife was being looked after. At the time, I told Colin she needs an awful lot of rest. I feel she's being looked after. When she eventually comes out of this peaceful rest and realizes what has happened, everything will be so beautiful that she will automatically accept it. And as we have seen, in due course, Sheila was able to renew contact with her children and communicate with Colin. Life in the next dimension has been beautifully described by an excellent medium, Bertha Harris, in her book, Traveler in Eternity. Music and concerts play a large part in it, and it sounds very enjoyable. We also definitely go through some further learning while we are there. However, after a period there, probably lasting 80 to 100 years, though it can be very much shorter, it seems that most of us choose to be reborn. You always have choices, whichever dimension you find yourself in. I feel, too, that people don't necessarily return to this planet because there are other planets on which they can be reborn, many of them invisible to us because they're vibrating on a different frequency. The universe is infinite, filled with worlds within worlds within worlds. Some of these are on much higher vibrational levels than Earth. We come back here because we have not progressed far enough to qualify for these higher worlds. For many years, I have had impressed on me the fact that there is no such thing as empty space. The thought has fascinated me, but with no qualifications in physics, I have been unable to follow it through. However, when I mentioned this to a value friend, Professor E.R. Laithwaite of Imperial College London, he was kind enough to send me the following extract by a physicist, which simplified things for me and seems to support my thinking. Of all the constraints on nature, the most far-reaching are imposed by space. For space itself has a structure that influences the shape of every existing thing. The idea that space has structure may sound strange, since we usually think of space as a kind of nothingness that is the absence of structure. We think of space as the emptiness within an empty container, as the passive backdrop for the lively play of material things. It turns out, however, that the backdrop, the all-pervading nothingness, is not so passive. The nothingness has an architecture that makes real demands on things. Every form, every pattern, every existing thing pays a price for its existence by conforming to the structural dictates of space. Since our brains and perceptual processes have evolved to suit our own space, we cannot visualize those other spaces, but we have devised self-consistent mathematical descriptions of them, and we have come to recognize that the spaces in the world of the very small, in the world of the fundamental particles, and in the world of the very large, as the scale of the universe as a whole, differ dramatically from the space in which we live. From The Pattern of Nature, Peter S. Stevens, 1977. I hope this information will at the very least make you think about space. After all, there is an awful lot of which is apparently non-functional. Before we return to this dimension, we decide to take on a specific task or fulfill a particular purpose. Knowing this can help us to make sense of seemingly terrible events. When I was talking with Colin Caffell, I found myself telling him that everything that had been happening to him had happened for a purpose and had unlocked a compassion in him that he didn't have before. I said, "You were brought into this world not to do what you wanted to do, but what you elected to do before you were born. You've been thrown into the cauldron because you were living your life for yourself, and somebody had to say, 'You didn't come here for this. You came here for something totally different. You are being forced to find the path of knowledge.'" And that is exactly what he is doing now. Colin, in fact, had not been living an especially selfish life, but he had not been following his pre-chosen path. By the time he came to see me, he was already back on the right path, but it was good for him to hear it confirmed, while knowing that his family were now peaceful and happy has given him the peace to continue. Among the decisions we make before returning is to choose our parents, whom we will have known in previous lives. If you want to know more about this, do read Peter and Mary Harrison's book, Life Before Birth, which contains the most fascinating descriptions by children who remember turning from the next dimension. Some of them recalled being pushed into a river and then being in mummy tummy. When I read this, I immediately connected it with the pool in my garden, where people were being bathed. I realized some time ago that it was a pool of energy, the same energy that I see around people. And this river, it seems, is also energy through which the mind is pushed in order to reach this dimension. Apart from it making sense, many of my own experiences confirm my belief in reincarnation. For one thing, I have noticed that I am very rarely able to get survival evidence for old people. The parents of people in their 70s or 80s very rarely come through, in my experience. My own mother now comes through less and less often, and we certainly don't hear from our ancestors, Although if they were still around in the other dimension, they might well be interested in their great-great-grandchildren. It seems to me obvious that people who have been dead for some time have moved on elsewhere, and I think it very likely that by now there are members of our particular circles on Earth. Reincarnation also explains why we can dislike or fall in love with people at first sight. If our knees start shaking at the sight of a stranger, it is probably not a stranger at all. We're actually recognizing a previous very close relationship. Very convincing to me, too, have been my experiences of regression to previous lifetimes. At the beginning of my professional career, while healing friends, their faces would seem to blur, and I would see a different face superimposed on theirs. I soon found out that if they continued to sit quietly, without any prompting from me, they would then regress back in time to recall memories of a previous life. I would ask them questions about how they felt and what they saw, being careful not to put any ideas into their minds. What was fascinating was that I would simultaneously be receiving clairvoyant information which tallied with what they were telling me. This happened very strikingly with Janet. We were sitting quietly together one day when I saw superimposed over her face the features of an obviously Spanish lady with black hair and rather dark skin, looking very regal and composed. Interestingly, Janet has always felt more at home in Spain than in England. Janet began loosening her collar. I didn't tell her what I could see until afterwards, but when I asked how she felt, she said, "Oh, I'm so hot, I'm so hot." I could see clairvoyantly that she was in a big house in South America, obviously part of a ranch as there were lots of horses around. Janet's regression lasted about half an hour, and she repeatedly complained about the heat. She told me afterwards that she felt that she was the lady of a grand house, and she, too, had been aware of the horses. She remarked afterwards that she thought she'd been rather hard done by in this life. "This is why I'm always so hard up," she said. "I had it all last time." These days, I very rarely have the time to indulge in this fascinating experience solely out of interest. I know that some people can become addicted to exploring their past lives. On the whole, I think we have enough to absorb our minds in dealing with the current one. However, when regression occurs spontaneously, the information that comes out of them helps to explain certain aspects of our current personality. Recently, I was giving a sitting to a friend when suddenly I said, "Just keep still. Close your eyes, because I've got something here. I'll tell you about it later." I could see her quite clearly wearing a milkmaid's cap and carrying a wooden yoke, and I also saw the house where she lived. Afterwards, I told her that her employers, who owned the house, had treated her very well, but she had never married or had children. In this life, my friend desperately wanted children. Having been denied them in a former life explains why she wanted them so badly. I told her, "I don't know why, but I'm being told that you're going back to your roots, somewhere in Devon, and when you get there, you'll recognize everything. The house you're going to buy will have a mountain ash in the garden." She exclaimed, "How fascinating, Betty. We're just moving down to Devon." Afterwards, she wrote to tell me that she had found and recognized the house where she'd lived as a milkmaid, and there was a mountain ash in their own garden. The chief relevance of this kind of experience is that it helps us to understand better why we are like we are now. It also demonstrates that something in us is everlasting. That something must be the mind, which carries from life to life things that have made an impact on it, such as the longing for a child. One very interesting point is that while people like to imagine themselves as former Cleopatras or Napoleons, what usually comes up is something that takes even me aback. I recently saw someone as a cripple who had cared for orphans during the last century. Never in a million years would I have expected to see this woman as a cripple. Yet it explains why she and others with similar past lives feel compelled to help people in this life and sometimes feel quite annoyed with themselves when they can't say no to requests for help. The inner knowledge of what it is to suffer has developed in them compassion for those who suffer in this life. Sometimes, if a past life memory is causing real trouble, regression can occur spontaneously as part of the healing process. Very early in my mediumship, I was giving healing for a pleasant, well-dressed woman when, to my astonishment, I began to see vivid pictures of a woman with greasy, matted hair clutching an enormous knife as she crawled over cobblestones in what could have been a prison. Suddenly, she plunged the knife into someone's back. Then, rather like a film, I saw a new picture in which she was devouring a loaf of bread. It was clear that she had killed someone to get that loaf, and that in those days she would have been hanged for it. I looked at this nice suburban lady and asked, "Are you afraid of knives?" "How did you know?" "I'll tell you in a moment. But are you especially afraid of big knives?" "Betty, I've never been able to pick up a carving knife. My husband always has to carve the meat." I think I've been given this picture as a healer to cure you of your fear. I then told her what I had seen. She was rather appalled at first, but given the kind of person she is now, her former self seemed so incongruous that we had to laugh about it. It's worth remembering when you think things are going badly that it's possible to laugh about a horrific event even in a previous life. Knowing that we have had many lives can certainly put our present problems in perspective. About 5 weeks later, she rang me to say, "Betty, I've got to thank you. I've completely lost my fear of knives." Understanding where the fear originated enabled her to let go of that fear. Not every soul chooses to reincarnate. The doctors who helped me, the scientists from the past like Pasteur, must have made some kind of choice to help the world from the other dimension. Let me tell you another story. A lady came to me for healing for terrible headaches caused by arthritis in the back of the neck. While I was healing her, I told her that a man had come through who said he was her doctor. She looked perplexed and said, "I've never had any doctors as friends. I don't like them." The communicator, however, continued with his message. "He's laughing," I told her, "and is saying that the last time you came was about your daughter who had awful ear and gland trouble." She frowned and asked me to describe the speaker. "I'm sorry, I can't see him," I said. Suddenly, in the corner of the room, the figure of a man manifested. "My God," I said, "it's Harry Edwards." The woman laughed. "Of course, now I understand. He was my family doctor, because I never went to anyone else." She was thrilled. Needless to say, so was I. He went on to remind her of numerous incidents which she remembered. Afterwards, she and I talked together for about 2 hours, exchanging stories about the great healer. You may wonder why she didn't simply give his name straight away. I think the reason is that jokingly referring to himself as her family doctor was much more convincing. Spirits often give clues rather than names. A fraudulent medium could easily say, "I've got Harry Edwards here." The real Harry Edwards pulled her leg, just as he did in real life. I think it is very likely that, as with doctors and scientists, great healers go on working from the other dimension, helping and guiding healers in this one. No experience is wasted, and what we learn the hard way in this life can be used in valuable service in the next. Life goes on, and so do we as individuals. We exist for the purpose of progressing spiritually in both this dimension and the next. Therefore, whatever level we are at on the spiritual ladder, it is important to strengthen and expand our minds in this dimension if we are to make any kind of impact in our future existences. Part 2. Healing. Chapter 5. You don't have to live with it. Quote by Betty Shine. "Having opened the door of hope, I know my spirit will soar and untold wonders will be revealed." End quote. People often ask what healing can cure. Since healing works on the energy counterpart and the mind energy, it's not so much a question of curing specific diseases as working on those energies and encouraging the person's positivity. Healing then takes place naturally. Over the years, I have helped hundreds of people with all kinds of physical and emotional problems, and I could write forever about the wonderful healings I have seen. However, for this chapter, I have chosen just a few typical and not so typical cases which illustrate how healing can cure almost any complaint, provided the physical body has not deteriorated beyond repair. Some of these people have kindly written their own accounts, which I shall be quoting to give you an idea of their experiences of healing. Numbers of people have been to see me after the medical profession had given up and they had virtually lost hope. One of these was Marjorie, who had reached the point where she was afraid of waking in the mornings. She had suffered appalling migraines for 8 years and was having to spend at least 1 day a week in bed. At her hospital, she'd been told that nothing could be done for her. She would just have to go home and live with her constant pain and misery. Then someone she met at a function gave her my name. Although she was quite frightened by the idea of visiting me, like so many people, she had a spooky image of healers. She was even more worried at the prospect of her pain continuing forever. Next day, she rang up for an appointment. Marjorie duly arrived, a woman in her 50s, looking decidedly nervous. The first thing I did was to help her relax by giving her some healing, explaining what I was doing as I went along. I found that the cause of her migraines was a tremendous amount of arthritic calcium in the back of her neck, which was pressing on vital nerves in her spine. I told her what I'd found, and after 15 minutes asked her to get up from the healing couch and sit on a chair. Then I placed my hand on her neck, and as the calcium broke up, there was such a loud bang that Marjorie thought I had broken her neck. I explained that this was quite usual when I placed my hands on arthritic joints, except that this was a particular loud bang. She was reassured enough to come back the following week for just one more healing session. After that, she made a complete recovery, and it is now several years since her last migraine. Another woman with a similar problem was a singer whom I shall call Veronica. I feel that she was led to me through the unseen helpers who work through healers. I have learned never to underestimate their power. Sometimes people come to me in very curious ways. One was a woman who was sitting on a bus in agony with back pain. A perfect stranger sitting next to her handed her a card and said, "I think you ought to go and see this lady." The woman was so surprised, she said, "Oh, thank you." The card had my name on it, but told her nothing about me. Nevertheless, she came and knocked at my door. When I opened it, she said, "I was given this card. I don't know why I've come." She soon discovered why when I gave her healing for her back. In Veronica's case, she had to go to Leeds to be given my address near her home in Surrey. She was up there recording a television show when she developed a severe tension headache, which is not unusual for performers under the glare of studio lighting. Her dresser suggested she had a massage by a fellow worker. This young woman turned out to be a former client of mine who, like many others, had become a healer herself. She simply put her hands on the back of Veronica's neck, and the headache instantly disappeared. Since Veronica was only in Leeds for the show, she gave her my name as someone she could see on a regular basis. When she first met me, Veronica was surprised and delighted to be told that I had been a singer too. There was no need to explain to me the strains and stresses of her life, and she knew I wouldn't regard her as a neurotic theatrical. She told me that she had been medically diagnosed as suffering from arthritis of the neck joints. This kept her in constant pain and limited her movements, very disabling for a singer. She was in agony whenever she hit a high note, and only daily pill taking made her life bearable. I was able to eliminate the arthritis completely in a few sessions, and I now see her about twice a year to top up the healing energy and prevent a recurrence. Something I recommend to everyone. It definitely keeps them healthy. Imagine, writes Veronica, no more pain, no stiff neck, no pill taking. It feels like a great concrete weight has been lifted off my head, and I am floating on air. Even colors seem brighter after a visit to Betty. Veronica is now a personal friend, and it's nice to think that because of healing, she can continue to give pleasure to thousands of people through her art. Healing can deal very effectively with headaches and migraines caused by tension or arthritis, and although I have not had enough cases to be categorical about it, I have found it to be equally effective with migraines associated with food allergies. I believe that allergies to certain foods are caused by an imbalance in the body's biochemistry that makes people react against the food, rather than the food itself causing the imbalance. When healing restores the biochemical balance of the body, the allergic reaction disappears without necessitating any change of diet. A slim, fair-haired young woman knocked on my door one day, hardly able to speak as she was in the throes of a terrible asthmatic attack. I led her into my healing room and, without asking any questions, immediately began to give her healing. After about 20 minutes, she had recovered her breath enough to talk. She told me her name was Jessica. She had recently been told by her hospital, after some 50 or 60 tests, that she appeared to be allergic to everything. If she ate fruit, her mouth and face would swell up. The family's pet greyhound had to be kept outside, and even so she suffered almost non-stop from asthmatic attacks. In short, her life was a misery. I studied the energies around her and could see that they were completely unbalanced. I offered to see her once a week, and after 6 weekly visits, Jessica went on holiday to Corfu. From there, she wrote to tell me that she was able to eat anything, even fruit, without any side effects. After she got back, the greyhound was allowed back indoors. She had made a total recovery. Jessica's energy counterpart had been so severely congested that it had simply gone from bad to worse. Nearly every major organ was compressed by negative energy, and many other vital parts of her body were unable to function. Healing eventually dislodged this congestion so that her body started taking over normally. Miserable and disabling as allergic conditions are, some skeptics might dismiss these kinds of healing as psychosomatic, the result of simply helping a tense person to relax, or the effect of suggestion on someone already predisposed to be cured. But not all cures can be explained away so easily. I have found that healing can improve or completely eliminate some very serious physical conditions in highly skeptical and unsuggestible people. One of these was Jan. When she made her appointment, she told me nothing about her problems or why she wanted to see me. In fact, she was deeply troubled by a kidney disease which had been diagnosed in 1978. Her consultant was obviously loath to give a prognosis. He had hopes that her condition could be kept under control for 5 years with medication, but he also warned her that she should make provision in her home for the eventual installation of a dialysis machine. Not a nice forecast for an attractive, intelligent, professional woman still in her 30s. At the time of her visit to me, she was on daily antibiotics and had so far maintained a satisfactory level. But she was very conscious that her condition was degenerative and that time could be running out. She said nothing of this to me. She had decided, as skeptics often do, to adopt the attitude of, well, let's see what she can do. Jan arrived on a cold January day, 1982, feeling, she writes, more than a little apprehensive. A million thoughts raced through my mind. What was I doing, me, the ever-skeptic, waiting at the doorway of a person I had never met? She was sure to be small, wizened and dressed in black. I almost turned away from the door. Fear, curiosity, call it what you will, held me there. I was to be so grateful for the split-second decision. The door was thrown open, and I was faced with a blonde, curly-haired, definitely not wizened, smiling face. You must be Jan. Do come in. My doubts and fears began to dissipate, and feeling a little more relaxed, I went in. When I asked Jan which particular psychic talent she required, she quickly answered clairvoyance, thinking this was safest. Her idea of this magical thing called faith healing, she told me later, conjured up pictures of cloaked bodies prancing around their victims in an almost pagan fashion. I gave her what she confirmed was an accurate account of her life so far, together with some forecasts for the future, which must remain private. At the same time, I received information about her kidneys and knew that she was in a very poor state of health indeed. I didn't wish to worry her too much, so I simply said, "I do think you would benefit from healing. May I try?" Jan seemed to like the idea, although she was still very skeptical, and during the session asked me a lot of very probing questions. I answered them as well as I could, and she seemed satisfied with my explanation that healing is a psychic science involving the manipulation of energies. Probably even more convincing, however, was what she experienced herself. Quote, "I was surprised as, whilst lying on the couch there was no more than what appeared to be the simple laying of hands. Gradually, I felt this burning sensation at the back of my throat, quite an unusual feeling, but one I had experienced before when having one of my kidneys tests. I was told by the doctor that I would experience this sensation as the dye traveled around my body. And here it was again, but this time it was the energy I could feel." End quote. I could see that the energy around her left kidney was seriously depleted. However, I was able to tell her that her right kidney was doing its best to cope with the extra burden. My clairvoyant diagnosis turned out to be perfectly accurate. Shortly afterwards, Jan received the result of an earlier hospital test which confirmed what I'd seen. I also knew clairvoyantly that she would recover completely. Though her steady improvement was still thrilling for both of us, Jan came for 6 sessions over 2 months, reducing to 1 a month and then to 1 every 2 months. She was eventually able to come off all medication and to this day remains fit and well. She now sees me perhaps once a quarter for her top-up, to which we both look forward as we have become good friends. Jan now has total belief in healing and has sent a number of people to me. It is encouraging to read that the medical profession is becoming more open-minded about healing. I hope it won't be too long before doctors regularly ask for the assistance of a healer when medicine is unable to produce a cure. So many patients are told to go home and live with it, or given gloomy prognosis. Yet there is now much evidence to show that healing can cure many of these hopeless cases. If doctors and healers could work together, not only could there be far less physical and mental suffering, but also the National Health Service drugs bill could be substantially reduced. When Annie Lamy came to see me, she was in her early 50s and had been suffering pain and embarrassment for over 20 years. In 1954, she went to the doctors with a terrible pain in her leg from her knee downwards. He diagnosed a strained muscle but offered no treatment, simply telling her to rest the leg. It was already swollen and became worse. She had to replace her size 6 shoes with size 7. When she asked for a second opinion, all that was suggested was that she wear an elastic stocking. The pain increased, spreading to the top of her leg. Finally, after years of worry, the problem was diagnosed as thrombosis and then phlebitis, for which no treatment was offered. Walking continued to be agony, and Anne could not even sit in comfort. She took other medical advice, but to no effect. The thrombosis remained for 23 years. As she worked in a health food store, she knew a lot about alternative therapies and tried vitamin and mineral supplements, but to no avail. Finally, a relative suggested she should try healing. When she came to me in 1980, her leg was still swollen and extremely hard. Simply pressing the muscle caused bruising, and there was a huge black hollow where the tissue had deteriorated. It was almost gangrenous. I felt very sorry for her. During the first healing, I could feel quite curious sensations in her leg from the knee downwards. It was just as if the muscles and ligaments were jumping madly up and down as they returned to healthy life. Anne could feel it too, as well as a tremendous heat. These odd muscle spasms happened every time she came to me. After the first healing, the tissues of her leg became softer, and from then on she improved steadily. She came for 6 weekly healings, and I then recommended her to visit me once a month. 3 months after the first healing session, Anne's leg began to fill out, hair began to grow again, and the formerly blackened part was a healthy color. Now, after 8 years, it's difficult to see that she had anything wrong at all. Occasionally her leg aches if she has to stand for a long time, but she has no other symptoms. I see her now perhaps 3 times a year. For 25 years, Anne had been unable to wear dresses without being embarrassed about the state of her leg. Now she wears them all the time. Only another woman would understand the happiness this has given her. Her whole outlook on life has changed to one of optimism. I have worked with a number of athletes who, through healing, have been able to take up their sport again almost immediately after an injury. Terry, a young man in his 20s, had practically given up hope of finding a cure for an Achilles heel problem he had suffered from for months. When he first ruptured the tendon playing squash, a fellow player who knew me begged him not to go to a hospital where they would put his leg in plaster for at least 3 months, but to come and see me instead. Terry's family had actually been closely involved with healing for many years, and he was aware that it could succeed where conventional practice had failed. However, being rather skeptical, he took no active part in it himself. He ignored his friend's advice and went to hospital. 3 months later, the tendon ruptured again during physiotherapy exercises. This time he decided that he might as well see me, though on the Saturday when he arrived, he was actually booked for an operation the following Monday. He was walking with a stick and in obvious agony. He writes, quote, "I visited Betty very much with the attitude that I had nothing to lose and a great deal to gain, but I would say that I was still resigned in entering the clinic on the following Monday. But instead of spending another 3 months in plaster, which I would have done had they operated, I was up and walking in 2 days after one session with Betty of about 40 minutes. After a short while, I was able to move a previously immovable ankle, and after a few days was up and walking again without aid. I could see and feel that there was a rapid improvement, and this continued after returning to see Betty on several other occasions. Having experienced this apparently miraculous cure, which conventional practice could in no way emulate, there is no doubt in my mind that healers like Betty Shine have the ability to initiate a rapid healing process." End quote. When Terry walked into his office that Monday, clearly out of pain when he should have been lying on an operating table, his colleagues were totally mystified. In fact, I estimate that my healing has cured about 200 Achilles heel problems. They usually respond magnificently. The healing energy has excellent effects with muscles, ligaments, and tendons. Of course, electromagnetism is now being used medically with these types of problems. I can't help wonder whether the doctors have been influenced by healing, as although they are not identical, there is a close similarity between electricity and healing energy. Another young man who has often come to see me with sports injuries is David, the footballer I mentioned in the last chapter. The first time he came, he was in quite a bad state, yet another young person who had been told to live with his pain. It started when he twisted his ankle and badly sprained 2 ligaments in his foot. A physiotherapist treated it with ice packs, manipulation, and ultrasound, and after 2 weeks, David was pronounced fit to play again, though his ankle was still rather sore. A month later, he sprained it again, this time tearing some tissue around the Achilles tendon. On the advice of friends, he went to see another physiotherapist who used the same methods as the previous one and sent him out to play again. This performance was repeated regularly for the next 4 years. David saw a total of 9 physiotherapists, all of whom temporarily eased the pain. However, as David was beginning to realize, none of them offered a cure for the weakness which was now affecting both ankles. In fact, the best advice one could give him was to come to terms with pain and put up with it. David writes, quote, "I put up with the pain for far too long. In fact, it got to the stage when after 2 games at the weekend, I was crippled, walking with a terrible limp. Before some games, I had to warm up for half an hour before the kickoff to get some circulation into my feet. To conclude, at the age of 20, my feet and ankles were well and truly knackered. When it was suggested that I could try a healer called Betty Shine, I offered no objections because I was prepared to try anything. On my first visit, Betty explained that the ligaments and muscles had taken such a battering that my main problem was one of circulation. She laid her hands on my legs, and almost immediately, what I can only describe as an inner heat welled up in my legs. This heat seemed to ebb and flow like a tide inside me, giving me a hypnotic sensation of being somewhere else. After 2 visits, I was completely cured. Since that day, I have visited Betty on dozens of occasions for all types of aches and pains and have never been disappointed. A good example of Betty's unique talent occurred when I received a kick in the groin during a game. A particularly eminent physiotherapist correctly diagnosed a slight hernia and fitted me up with a makeshift truss. He explained that I wouldn't be able to play for another month and that I should see him again next week in case the injury deteriorated. The following night, Betty was able to see me and successfully cured the hernia. I played again the following Saturday. When the physio did check me over again, he expressed confusion, but eventually decided he had been wrong because a hernia couldn't possibly heal in such a short time. End quote. David has had some remarkable healings, including the manipulation I had already described, and other times my limbs would creak, groan, and crack aloud as damaged ligaments and the like snapped back into place. Quote, "The more I went to her, the more aware I became of what was happening, and in my trance-like state, I was able to imagine what was happening inside of me. Once I remember seeing what looked like a limp and flattened tubular pipe being inflated with a red beam of light which flowed along the tube, seemingly revitalizing its life and restoring it to its proper shape. This was very interesting. David was sharing with me the ability to see his meridian lines. This heightened vision during healing quite often happens with people who are psychic, like the young woman who could see colors. David is not in fact psychic, but very powerful healing seems to enable some people to experience psychic vision, which is lovely, in the same way that people's colors perception is often enhanced. Seeing colors as brighter after healing is a quite common experience. When people receive a powerful injection of life force, this expands the mind energy outwards further than usual, enabling them to link up to the next dimension just enough to experience colors as they are experienced in that dimension. John was another total skeptic who came to me with a very physical problem. An athletic, nice-looking man in his 30s, he has his own publishing business and is extremely astute. We met at a party given by a mutual friend who told the guests before I arrived that I was a healer, clairvoyant and medium. Most of them were keen to meet me, but John was quite uninterested. However, when I arrived, I went over to him and said, "I don't know why, but I have to come and introduce myself to you." We had an instant rapport and for a while chatted away quite happily. When I told him I was a healer, he said, "I don't believe in all that." I just laughed and said, "I heal the non-believers as well." While we were talking, I understood why I felt impelled to talk to him. Somebody called Jack began pestering me to communicate with him urgently, so I asked if he would mind letting him come through. Still disbelieving, John said he had no objection. The information came through quickly. Jack said that he had owned a motorbike and sidecar, mentioned several names, and described a variety of buildings in South London. His urgency was because John's mother hadn't been well recently, and Jack and her other spirit friends wanted to help her. I told John that he must contact his mother. All this information was really for her. A few days later, John phoned his mother and passed this on. She confirmed that she'd had an Uncle Jack with a motorbike and sidecar. The area he had described was his home, and the people he had named were relatives she had known when young. She also said that she hadn't been feeling well, though she was now feeling much better. The details of the survival evidence were unimportant in themselves, but the fact that they were accurate gave John some food for thought. About a year later, we met again. I reminded him of our talk and asked if his mother had confirmed the information. When he told me she had, I pulled his leg and said that I preferred more instant confirmation. I was also able to tell him that the survival evidence had been given as a catalyst to bring him closer to his mother, with whom he had not been on very good terms. By now, John's attitude had totally changed from indifference to great interest. He was even more surprised when I asked him what had happened to his right calf muscle, which I could tell had atrophied. I had to laugh at John's startled expression as he said, "How the hell can you see through my trousers?" He told me that a few years earlier he had broken both legs in several places while playing football, owing to complications. He had spent nearly 12 months in plaster. His right leg had wasted, and he had spent many months trying to build up the muscles in order to run without a limp. More recently, he had completed an intense 2-week course of physiotherapy at Headley Court Hospital, which had been very successful. He had followed this up with regular training at a gymnasium. However, he still had a problem. Whenever he stopped training, the calf muscle visibly shrank. I felt sure I could help him and got him to lie on my healing couch. Here is John's account of what happened next. Quote, Betty held my ankle in one hand and placed her other hand over the now healed break. She sat quietly and calmly, and I was completely relaxed. After a few minutes, she asked if I felt anything, and I explained that from the knee downwards my leg was cold. During the healing, I was given more survival evidence, but this time the names and information meant something to me, and I was able to confirm that everything passed on to me was correct. When I left that first healing session, which lasted about an hour, I felt physically and mentally stimulated and was looking forward to seeing Betty again in a week's time. In the back of my mind, I still had a doubt that Betty could stop my muscle from shrinking, but what could I lose? There was no way that I could be fooled. Either my muscle would stop shrinking or not. A measuring tape would provide the evidence, but this time I had stopped training. When Betty started healing my leg, the right calf muscle was smaller than my left. After only 2 sessions, my right calf was bigger than my left. When I told Betty on arrival for my 3rd healing, she laughed and said it would settle down. Both muscles would soon be the same size, and I would not have any more problems with wasting. She was quite correct, and I am pleased to say that in the years that have followed, the calf muscle remains strong, and despite having done no training, the size has been constant. End quote. John and I have been good friends ever since, and have spent many enjoyable hours discussing the philosophy of life, death, religion, and healing. He has since recommended me to many of his friends. One had an ear problem and had been put on a waiting list to see a consultant. Rather than wait 6 months, she came to see me, and her hearing was restored. I have been able to restore hearing many times. In the majority of these cases, I have seen clairvoyantly that the deafness was apparently caused by a small amount of calcium building up and spreading from a bone in the inner ear, usually as the after effect of a virus, which healing energy can easily disperse. I've also had a lot of success with Meniere's disease. Another friend of John's was Len, who came while he was here on a visit from Australia. He had been blind in one eye for 20 years, and now, after a series of hemorrhages behind the other eye, he had no sight at all. His wife had to lead him by the hand everywhere. He had seen consultants at 3 major eye hospitals, all of whom had told him that he had no hope of ever regaining his sight. After the first healing, John's father took him to London. When they arrived at Paddington Station, Len announced, "I can see the lights." From that moment on, his sight began steadily to return. When he returned to Australia, I continued giving him absent healing with my laser beam technique. A year later, on his next visit to England, he came to see me. He walked in by himself, looked at me and said, "You look exactly how I thought you would." It was a very emotional reunion. Len can now write his own letters, decorate and play golf, with help because his long-distance sight is not marvelous, but he can see. Although it's an area that I love, not many blind people have come to me for healing. I would like to do more of it. I would certainly never claim to be able to heal all cases of blindness, but over the years I have brought sight back to about 10 people. Of one of them I have particular vivid memories. Peter's blindness had been caused by a disease that strikes young men, and he had been told it was incurable. He came for about 10 healings, and by the 7th, we were both getting a bit despondent as there seemed to be no change. But after the 8th healing, he suddenly said, "Betty, I can see a candle flickering as though being blown by the wind." I couldn't be sure what it meant. He was seeing it with his inner vision, and we were both delving in the dark. But I said, "Peter, I think candlelight means hope." After that, the candle never left him. He could see it all the time. His 10th session was his last with me, as he had to move away. I suggested that he go to George Chapman, a healer who specializes in eye problems. He wrote to Mr. Chapman, but before he could visit him, he went on holiday to Scotland. On his first morning there, he woke up with his sight completely restored. Peter didn't know whether George Chapman had actually received his letter, but as I told him, so long as he was cured, what did it matter? Possibly writing the letter had linked him in with Mr. Chapman's healing energies, just as people who think of me receive help whether I am aware of it or not. I believe now that the vision of the candle was sent to him as a message to say, "Hang in there, there's hope." There are still far too many cases which are classed as incurable because the doctors are baffled. The reason is, usually, that negative energy congestion is pressing on a vital spot and undermining the working of a major organ or other part of the body. Despite the incredible feats of medical science, nothing has yet been devised medically that can detect the most basic requirement of all existence, life force energy. And so the real cause of countless complaints goes unrecognized and untreated. Fred, for instance, whom I introduced in the last chapter, had had a total of 89 hospital tests in an effort to trace the cause of his problem. Shortly after the episode of the hobnailed boots, Shirley contacted me to ask to give Fred some healing. He had been suffering from what seemed to be a virus infection, which had steadily grown worse over the previous year. He had pains in his legs and hands, and great difficulty in breathing, and had eventually collapsed with a high fever. He was tested for all kinds of infection from Lassa fever and glandular fever to all known viruses at the hospital for tropical diseases. All the tests proved negative, and Fred was eventually discharged. The doctors could not identify anything to treat. He came to see me in October 1978, a slim, quiet, rather shy man, and a little skeptical of healing. I couldn't identify the virus either, but of course I was able to work on his energy system, and I knew I could get him better. At that point, his energy counterpart seemed drawn totally inwards into an almost solid mass, rather than having the vibrating appearance to be seen around a healthy person. He came weekly until shortly before Christmas for 5 sessions in all. Within 2 weeks, he was feeling noticeably better, and by the end he was completely cured, with his energy system back to normal. Afterwards he wrote, "I can now honestly say that I feel better than I have done for several years. My breathing is normal, I am sleeping well, and most of all, I am now leading a healthy and energetic life once more. As I am still in my early 40s, this is most important." Both Shirley and Fred received a lot of healing and clairvoyance from me. During one of Fred's healing sessions, he told me he had a cancerous wart on his head, which was going to be surgically removed. When I gave him healing, I knew that the operation wouldn't be necessary and told him so. 2 weeks later, the growth had disappeared. When Fred next visited his doctor, he told him what had happened. The doctor examined him and confirmed that the growth had gone. This doctor was more open-minded than some. He had heard similar stories before, he said, and wasn't altogether surprised. There are some diseases which healing cannot always help, especially when the condition has advanced too far to reverse it. Occasionally, too, I come across a few people who for some reason just don't respond to healing. These days, however, I am specializing in so-called incurable cases, and sometimes the results are beyond my expectations. Currently, for instance, I have been getting good results with a man with motor neuron disease. From my point of view, it appears that with this crippling disease, the blood supply to the nerves going through the muscles has been cut off. As I've mentioned, healing energy works very well with circulatory problems. This particular man's leg was completely bloodless when he first came, and as cold as a marble. During the first healing, he experienced the energy like a series of electric shocks. When he returned home, his big toe became red and swollen as the blood supply returned. On his second visit, he was already walking about the room with no support for the first time for months, and is overjoyed as the use of his muscle returns. I would never claim, however, to be able to cure motor neuron disease. Sometimes it takes over the system very rapidly, and once it is advanced, sadly, I can do nothing about it. But anyone with a disease like this, including multiple sclerosis or muscular dystrophy, could gain an awful lot of benefit if their muscles were strengthened by healing energy. Another disease the doctors find hard to treat, and with which I have had quite a lot of success, is rheumatoid arthritis, whose effects can be agonizing. Shirley's mother, for instance, had suffered from it for many years and was in constant pain. She couldn't even bear to be touched. As is common with this disease, her bones had been affected. Her legs had become misshapen, and her arms would no longer straighten, so that her coat sleeves had to be shortened. It was becoming increasingly difficult for her to hold a cup of tea without dropping it. Shirley brought her to see me in December 1979, and she came regularly at monthly intervals for 4 years. Since she had to travel quite a distance, she couldn't come more often. It was necessary to keep the healing going because of her age. Older people do need more healing than the young, especially if the physical body has deteriorated in other ways, as hers had. Even so, as the months went by, a wonderful improvement took place. Her legs began to straighten out, the inflammation left her hands, and she became virtually pain-free for the first time for 20 years. Because I had to move, she was unable to visit me after those 4 years, and as happens in old people, the arthritis took over again. But at last, before she died, she had some pain-free and enjoyable years, which she would not otherwise have had. In younger people, the healing is generally total, and they do not need years of treatment. One young woman of 28 had been unable to walk for years because both her hips were completely frozen by arthritis. She had an operation to release one hip, but complained when she came to see me. I can't move my other leg, although the doctors say with exercise I should be able to. When I looked at her, I felt that the first operation had been unnecessary. It was clear to me that she was locked at the pelvis and not at the hips. So I worked on her pelvic joint, which was packed with calcium deposits, and little by little got the leg moving, each time with the usual bangs, cracks, and explosions. I asked her to let me know if it hurt, but she assured me that it didn't. After these explosions, there would be a satisfying increase in mobility of her leg. In the end, though she still limped on the side that had been operated on, the untouched leg and hip were completely cured. Sometimes surgery is essential, but even then healing can help speed up recovery. In 1979, Shirley was coming to see me regularly for clairvoyance and usually had healing as well. I knew that she had some health problems, which she also knew about, and at one session I told her that she would have to take an enforced rest. Shortly afterwards, she was admitted to hospital for an emergency hysterectomy. Afterwards, the doctor telephoned Fred to say that if she hadn't had the operation then, she would only have lived a month, as her bladder had deteriorated and was causing extensive complications. Shirley would need 6 months rest to recover completely. I gave her absent healing while she was in hospital, and when she came out, she visited me for contact healing. After 2 weeks, she went for a hospital checkup. The surgeon told her he had never seen such a rapid recovery. She was doing far better than some patients who had had less serious operations. She was completely better within a month. Orthodox surgery and healing combined had produced the perfect cure. Another young woman, Leah, went ahead with an operation which turned out to not be necessary. Leah is a very attractive and lively young businesswoman who had previously been to see me for her severe tension in the summer of 1980 and recovered beautifully. This story is told in the next chapter. A couple of years later, she was advised by a leading gynecologist to have an immediate operation for the removal of a cyst. This was just before Christmas, and although it was urgent, she persuaded the surgeon to postpone it until the new year. In the meantime, she came to see me and asked my advice. I gave her some healing straight away, during which a voice told me, "They won't find anything." So, at the end of the session, I said, "There, they won't find a thing." Leah stared at me incredulously and reminded me that she had been examined by 2 very capable professionals. This is Leah's account of what happened next. Quote, "The day of the operation arrived and I had long since dismissed Betty's claim. I confess here and now, with a canyon full of groveling apologies, that I did not believe her. I was wheeled down to the hospital theater and lost my senses until a few hours later when I saw my surgeon standing over me in the recovery room. He asked how I felt and I struggled to regain my thoughts and focus. I felt droopy, but not in the least sore or pained. I told him so. That's not surprising, he said. It's quite extraordinary, but we couldn't find anything there." End quote. Over the years, a number of people have come to me for help with cancer of various kinds, and sometimes healing can bring about a cure. I have had some remarkable successes with breast cancer, especially when the women concerned have come to me early. Some 50 in all have come to me with lumps in the breast. About 35 had already been diagnosed as having cancer, while the others were too scared to have medical tests. In about half of them, the lumps have simply disappeared beneath my hands in one session. Sue's problems were bigger than this, however. Sue is a management consultant, a slim, dark lady in her 40s, whose deceptively quiet manner conceals a lot of determination. She had already survived 2 encounters with cancer, in her 20s and again in her 30s, despite the appalling physical and mental side effects of radiation and chemotherapy, and despite being sent home at one point to write her will. When it struck a 3rd time, she refused further medical treatment and decided to conquer the disease by willpower alone. She was helped by a new man friend who provided plenty of emotional support. She acquired a new job and a new home and believed she was definitely on the up. It's extraordinary, writes Sue, how certain scenes are transfixed in your memory, like still pictures suddenly held in a motion film. Quote, "In my case, I had just reached the landing in my new home and was turning back to my guest, still with my hand on the banister, when she said, 'Sue, I think you ought to see Betty. She's a wonderful healer and a great friend of mine.' The implication was instantly obvious. I wasn't winning the battle with the cancer I thought I had already defeated. For once in my checkered career, I had everything going for me, and I honestly thought I had already beaten the big C by mind over matter. The magic of that evening and by my pride in my new home were destroyed in that instant. I remember arguing that I was okay, marvelous, a bit tired perhaps, but fit as a fiddle, and I didn't need mumbo jumbo. I also remember being bullied by everybody there into making an appointment with Betty on the basis that it couldn't do any harm anyhow." End quote. Sue never kept her first appointment. By accident or by design, she got lost en route. She phoned to apologize and agreed to come back bringing her man friend for moral support. I'm always quite happy for people to bring their partners or friends along with them. Both were skeptical when they arrived. Sue because she still refused to accept that she wasn't well, and Dennis because he thought healers were a highly dubious mixture of charlatans, spiritual pontificators, and well-meaning, but powerless do-gooders. Sue writes, quote, "I was the first to succumb. Betty was large, lovely, overflowing with warmth and compassion, and a compulsive giggler. I loved and trusted her on sight. Dennis was knocked out when she politely inquired how successful the operation of his right Achilles tendon had been. She could only have known about that clairvoyantly." End quote. Sue seemed very clear about what was wrong with her and told me she wasn't going to go through any more chemotherapy or radiation treatment. I'm always very careful when giving people a clairvoyant diagnosis, but from what she told me, I assumed that her medical advisors had put her fully in the picture. I told her that the most serious problems and the most difficult to heal were the breakdown of the intestinal lining of her lower bowel and the deterioration of the walls of her veins and arteries. I could also see that she had a blood problem. There were clearly too many white cells, indicating a form of leukemia. When I told Sue this, she said, "I beg your pardon? Haven't they told you this?" I asked. "No, they bloody well haven't," said Sue. I felt bad about this and hastened to assure her that healing is very good for blood and circulation problems. By the end of the healing session, Sue was very relaxed and, to quote her, profoundly relieved someone was taking a personal interest in me, knew exactly what was wrong, and offered a reasonable but not totally optimistic prognosis. A few days later, before my next treatment, I phoned the GP who had seen me through my most difficult days before I had moved south. "Why didn't you tell me the damn thing was destroying my whole blood and circulatory system?" I demanded. "Who the hell was stupid enough to tell you that?" was his reply. "You've got enough problems coping with the cancer you do know about without some stupid so-and-so telling you that you are riddled with additional problems which nobody can do anything about." It wasn't a typical GP reply, but then he wasn't a typical GP. When I explained about Betty, his only reaction was positive. He firmly believed that cancer was caused by emotional and physical trauma or strain, triggering off a natural or genetic propensity in the cell structure. He knew my case history. He'd also seen many people who should have recovered from cancer just lie down and die, and equally others who recovered against all the medical odds. His advice was, if you believe it will help you, go ahead. And I did. End quote. The fact that I had given her a correct diagnosis, even if it was a shock to her, was very convincing to Sue. She came to see me regularly for healing after that. She never once doubted that she would be cured, even though it was some time before I was sure myself. Quite early on, she was given a spiritual operation during which the smell of ether made her feel choked and nauseous. The vividness of this experience and the realization that there was no way that I could have manufactured it myself increased her faith in healing. Although she had been far from positive at first visit, once she began to feel well and realized that healing could really help her, her own positive attitude carried her through. At a medical examination some 5 months later, she told the doctor absolutely truthfully that she couldn't remember when she had felt so well. He gave her a clean bill of health. All the tests failed to find any trace of cancer or any abnormality in her blood. As an additional bonus, says Sue, my bowels were regular for the first time since childhood. That was 5 years ago. In the interim, Sue has developed spondylitis and arthritis as the aftermath of a serious accident which prompted one company doctor to turn her down for a job on the basis that she'd be in a wheelchair within 3 years. She isn't. She came back to see me and is perfectly fit again. She writes, in the past few months, I have stripped wallpaper and plaster, painted ceilings, humped carpets, and with only the usual aches and pains. Betty has stopped a progressively degenerative disease progressing. Not surprisingly, Sue is still anxious about a possible recurrence of cancer. About 4 years after she recovered, she started bleeding heavily from the rectum and immediately panicked. She was in Europe at the time, and her man's friend instant reaction was to phone me for help rather than to call a doctor. I told her, don't worry, it's not serious, but it doesn't need treatment. Go to the doctor. She did, and found that it was simply a non-malignant polyp, which was easily removed. She writes, quote, it's tempting to eulogize someone who has given you the gift of health and strength and an unexpected lease and quality of life, to wax emotional and to try and find reasons and explanations for it all. The simple fact is that Betty's particular magic cured me when the medical professional had given up. Equally, I know that she will help me through any future illness, even if that help means making my inevitable death one day a dignified and relatively painless exit. End quote. Letters like this are proof of the seemingly impossible being achieved in the gentlest manner, and that the energies around us can be harnessed and used. Sue speaks of magic. I would say that a healer is an alchemist who transmutes life force into a mixture of elements which alter the complex physical makeup of the body, bringing about changes which are far beyond current scientific expectations. The attitude of Sue's doctor must have helped her a lot. So many people still lack the courage to tell their doctors when they benefit from healing. This is one reason why healing has so long remained an undercover operation. Fortunately, the tide is turning pretty rapidly, and nearly all the people who visit me now speak openly about the help they receive. To their doctor's credit, they very rarely receive a negative response. It has not so far been possible for me to demonstrate the potential of healing to an audience of English doctors, but in 1982, I was invited to participate in a medical seminar on healing in Segovia in Spain. Because it has only recently been possible to practice healing openly in Spain, Spanish doctors are much more fascinated by the whole subject than most English doctors. The English have been aware of the existence of healing for so many years that they tend to shrug it off without really investigating it. By contrast, at the end of the Segovia seminar, all the doctors I spoke to said in heartfelt tones that they were sorry that something so wonderful had been kept from them. As a group, they were the friendliest members of the medical profession I have ever met. I traveled there with Barry Stonehill, a friend who has traveled the world testing all kinds of alternative healing methods. On the way, we stopped in Madrid, where Barry invited me to meet a friend, an elderly man whom he described as an old boulevardier. Since he was always on the move, Barry used to drop in on friends abroad at rather short notice. When we arrived at this man's house, we were both shocked to discover that he was blind. He was in his 70s and had developed cataracts in both eyes, which were not yet ripe to be operated on. Barry at once announced that I was a healer and asked if he would like some healing. The old gentleman thought we were joking and just laughed. The joke, as Barry said afterward, was on him. We were going out to eat and didn't have much time. I wasn't sure that I could help the man because his eyes were extremely cloudy, so I said I would give him 15 minutes healing and boost this with absent healing later. After the 15 minutes were up, the boulevardier got up, walked out onto the terrace and exclaimed, "My God, I can see the flowers." That seemed miraculous even to me, and I said, "Can you?" The old gentleman was quite overcome. He kept saying, "I don't believe it. I can see you, and I can see the flowers." Some of the most fantastic healings I find occur when I don't feel I've really done anything. An hour later, the boulevardier took us out to a restaurant, guiding us all the way there. He was anxious to know whether his sight would last. I couldn't be sure, because I had the impression that he didn't take very good care of himself, and hardened arteries contribute to the formation of cataract. However, when Barry rang him a month or so later, his sight was still fine. The seminar itself lasted 5 days, and I worked about 12 hours a day. The healers and therapists were allocated to small groups for most of the time, and we got together at the end for a summing up. In my group, as well as healing, I was giving clairvoyance, survival evidence, clairvoyant diagnosis, and hypnotherapy. There were about 500 delegates, practically all in the medical profession, some of whom had bought patients to be guinea pigs. There were a few skeptics among them, but healing took place that evening they simply could not discount. For me, the outstanding memory is the impact we had on one particular doctor. One of the people I was asked to take a look at was a man of perhaps 30 who had come with his medical practitioner. He had been unable to walk unaided for 2 years, and despite numerous investigations, nobody had been able to find out why. I could immediately see clairvoyantly that the artery in his groin was kinked, probably owing to a thinning of the artery wall, and this was cutting off the blood supply to his leg. I gave him healing in the form of psychic operation, which straightened out the artery, and finished the session with hypnotherapy to help him stop chain smoking, which could have been contributing to his circulation problems. When we'd finished, the man got up saying he felt very dizzy. He went outside, walking perfectly normal, and immediately lit up a cigarette. You can't win them all. On our journey to Madrid, Barry and I stopped off at a bar on the highway for a snack. As we walked into the bar, we were approached by this man and his doctor, who were also there. They were delighted. The doctor told us that he had thoroughly examined his patient and that he had been completely cured. 2 years later, I heard that he was still fine. In years to come, such cures will be commonplace, in much the same way that past discoveries like electricity, broadcasting, and space travel have become part of our everyday life. And as our knowledge has progressed, our minds have had to open up to accept the evidence. It is still rare for a doctor to seek healing. Perhaps half a dozen have come to me in my 13 years as a healer. However, even doctors are sometimes told to learn to live with it and pushed to seek alternatives. I'd like to tell you Anton's story in some detail, because as a doctor with a totally scientific training, he had been taught to question science and to question all phenomena from a scientific point of view, and wasn't able to believe in anything without scientific evidence to back it up. Anton had worked in the National Health Service for 20 years as a clinical biochemist and was also a doctor of philosophy. In 1976, his younger daughter had started doing gymnastics. Since she was clearly gifted, Anton and his wife decided to help her by qualifying as club coaches, as defined by the British Amateur Gymnastics Association. They worked hard, and while the child's skill improved, so did her parents' coaching abilities. Anton went on to teach gymnastics at national level, which meant supporting children in advanced moves, and that was how he came to damage his left elbow. He went to see an orthopedic surgeon at his hospital, who diagnosed tennis elbow and prescribed a steroid injection together with physiotherapy 3 times a week for 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, however, the arm was no better. The surgeon advised a further steroid injection and a further course of physiotherapy. Needless to say, writes Anton, my arm did not recover. The surgeon then suggested an operation consisting of stripping the muscle from the attachment to the bone in the elbow. This would lessen the pain and allow the irritated, torn attachment to heal itself. So Anton agreed. It was a number of weeks before the pain subsided, and Anton had enough strength to use his arm normally, aided by further physiotherapy and strengthening exercises. Then, feeling that his body was healed, he went back to coaching his daughter. As he realized later, this was a mistake. As a doctor, he found it interesting that, although he had no further pain in his elbow, his shoulder now became painful and grew worse as he continued coaching. He returned down the well-trodden path to the orthopedic surgeon, who recommended an injection in the shoulder, followed by further physiotherapy. Some 5 weeks later, the shoulder was still painful. Yet another injection was followed by 5 more weeks of pain, by which Anton was practically immobile and had given up coaching. There was a further injection and a further 5 weeks of pain with still no improvement. At this point, Anton couldn't lift his left arm even to put a jacket on. His wife had to help him dress. By now, he had received the maximum amount of steroid deemed safe, and his colleague told him nothing further could be done medically. Anton must come to terms with the fact that he was disabled. During this time, he had become a consultant clinical biochemist and had been working closely with a publisher, my friend John, who suggested he should consider seeing a healer. Like many scientists, Anton recognized the existence of healing, but since he couldn't understand it scientifically, it was to be several months before he was prepared to try it. One day, however, John rang me up while Anton was visiting. He told me a doctor friend was having problems with his elbow, but was very skeptical and could not be persuaded to visit me personally. I said, I think you'll find your friend's problem is with his shoulder. John checked this out, and of course Anton confirmed that indeed the problem was now in his shoulder. Perhaps that helped him to overcome his reluctance to visit me, though even after making an appointment he was filled with trepidation. His idea of a healer was of someone who would go into a trance, make some strange noises, and really become quite abnormal. However, like others before him, he felt he had nothing to lose and kept his appointment. Here is Anton's account of what actually happened. Quote, when I met Betty, I was surprised to find that she was a very ordinary person, very lively and very friendly, quite different to what I was expecting. She explained what she was going to do and that I would probably need to see her 5 or 6 times. She then put her hands on my shoulder and closed her eyes. Her hands became very warm, and I felt extremely comfortable. Betty then explained that she was receiving messages. There was no doubt in my mind that she was indeed receiving information from my grandparents who had died a number of years previously. The interesting thing was that her description of my grandmother, an unusual person, was extremely accurate. There was no way she had got any of this information from me. I could not explain it, but there was no doubt that she was learning about me when I was a child. I had to accept it for what it was. Very difficult if all your life you have been testing hypotheses and receiving scientific answers. The interesting thing was the message my grandmother had given Betty. I must believe. I must admit, when I left Betty, I was beginning to believe. End quote. Although it took him over an hour to drive home, Anton's left shoulder was still hot when he arrived. He asked his wife to feel it, and she could feel the heat too. After Anton had visited me once a week for 4 weeks, the pain had gone completely, and he had total movement in his left arm. Being a scientist, however, he still felt that his recovery could be a coincidence. He tested it out by coaching gymnastics again, including teaching the somersault that had caused the problem in the first place. I had actually told him to stop coaching. The muscles and tendons had been damaged by the operation, and his arm really wasn't strong enough to resume that kind of activity. However, although he was beginning to believe, He had to prove to himself that the healing had in fact taken place. About a year later, in 1982, his shoulder, not surprisingly, became extremely painful again. He rang me for another appointment. As soon as he arrived, I knew at once that he had been coaching gymnastics again. His pain vanished after one session, but his tendons had been damaged by the operation, and I knew he would be in trouble again if he continued his activities. I told him that he must stop if he wanted to remain pain-free. Anton was satisfied by now with his experiment on himself that healing worked. There was no doubt in my mind that healing had removed the pain. Healing had healed my shoulder, he writes. Now that he was completely convinced, he decided that he ought to know more about healing and came to see me specifically to talk about it. He was worried about the occasions during his work in the National Health Service when the side effects of drugs given to patients were worse than their original illness. Healing struck him as a far nicer, non-invasive technique. I knew that, like many doctors, he had healing gifts himself and told him so, writes Anton, quote, "By now, I was no longer surprised by what Betty had to say. Her predictions generally came true. She explained to me that I would be leaving the health service. At the time, I was extremely happy and could see no reason for leaving. As it transpired, I started to help Betty, and after a number of months, I began to see people by myself at home to help them with healing. Also, as Betty had predicted, I had become disenchanted with the National Health Service and decided to leave. I set up a partnership with my publisher friend, and it is becoming quite successful." End quote. Anton came and joined in my healing sessions, which I found very interesting, as he was able to describe people's problems from the medical point of view. Within 3 months, he was receiving clairvoyant diagnosis, not seeing in the way that I do, or receiving spirit messages, but through an inner knowing. This inner knowing, which I am sure many doctors possess, coupled with his medical knowledge, enabled him to tell people exactly what was wrong, and his healing became daily more effective. Although he only heals part-time as he has a family to support, he has the potential to work successfully as a full-time healer. He also has those essential qualities, compassion and love for his fellow men. Long ago, when doctors had more time, they used to sit at the bedside and hold their patient's hand and say, "You will feel better tomorrow." These doctors were natural healers. They didn't use many drugs because they weren't available. By holding the patient's hands, a healing energy flowed from the doctor and the healing process had begun. I have come across several doctors who have been natural healers without knowing it. They're not only successful medical men, they also have an abundance of love and compassion. No one can work really effectively as a healer without possessing compassion for every living thing. To heal, compassion must be present in the very essence of your being. If you are one of these beautiful, sensitive souls that have that energy towards healing, you may be interested in the next chapter. This is where Betty Shine explores various healing methods and also highlights that healing is not only physical, but also emotional and spiritual. I'll meet you at the next video as we continue with this book titled Mind to Mind. If you haven't done so, please do hit the like button, leave a comment. If you have anyone that you know that's interested in this topic, please share it with them and subscribe to the channel.